excited today. We've been doing these virtual meetings for over 4 years now, and we're really delighted that our president is presenting for the first time. This is a topic that he's really passionate about, and he wanted to participate in this particular discussion. Many of you already know Gary, but he is the co-founder and the CEO not only of CS3 but several other businesses. He's also a published author, 18 Service Pillars, the Basis of an Exceptional Organization. He started his career a long time ago, he admits, back in '78 doing tax preparation, and he's always been an entrepreneur and owned various businesses since that time. His specialties really include strategic relationships, service and product direction, and oversights of operations. We also have Justin Michelson, who's an account manager here at CS3 Technology. He's going to be interviewing Gary today, and he graduated from the University of Central Arkansas with a PR and communications degree back in 2010. And then he went directly into selling big data center hardware. He's worked in technology ever since. Then he moved to Tulsa a few years back, where we snagged him and hired him here at CS3, and he's since relocated back to Arkansas and works for us remotely, as do many of our employees, as you all know. So Justin and his family are very happy to be in Springdale, and he heads up all the efforts for our ERP software sales. With that introduction, I'm going to hand this over to you, Justin.
Outstanding, everyone. Thank you so much. My list of achievements isn't quite as deep as our president's, the person I'll be interviewing, but I'm excited to be on the team and excited to continue growing with that. So that being said, today's topic, I'm going to be interviewing Gary about business software, something that's near and dear to my heart, of course, as an ERP sales consultant, as an account man in technology, and of course, as a younger professional. This is something that I've never done without. And I would say that it's an ideal time to talk about it, as we're now entering a tipping point from legacy systems into the modern era of cloud-driven systems, because the number of businesses who can do their business without software, I would say, has to be in the single-digit percentiles. And certainly with the folks that I work with, that I'm having conversations with, that are part of the professional organizations that I've been a part of, I don't hear anyone that is not interacting with the business software on a daily basis and that isn't critical to their environment. So, as we talk about the new normal of business software, one of the big drivers for this conversation was a survey that Grant Thornton, the accounting group, did of 300 CFOs. And I'm not going to go through this entire bullet point, but basically they were asking them what drives their investment strategy as they're thinking about technology. And I want to note two specific changes that are going to be coming up that CFOs of companies of all sizes are seeing in the next 2 years, and that's that improved customer experience jumps from number 3, where it's at today, to number 1. And that's because as more customers than ever are interacting with companies in a digital way. It's more and more rare that you're going to visit an office to do business as a consumer. These things are happening via the web, via other applications. So it really changes how we're doing business. And we're also looking at our own employees as customers, as they're the ones who have to interact with a lot of the software. And the other big point I want to bring up here, and that Gary's going to talk about, is that improved competitive differentiation is going to be something that wasn't considered before, but with everyone using software to run their businesses even better than humanly possible. That's the benefit of software. More companies than ever are going to be looking at how they can leverage theirs better than their competitors to take advantage of the marketplace that's relying on this software. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today, the new normal. We're going with a nice light spring theme here. I want you to be thinking about growth and fresh flowers and things like that. So here we go. We'll first talk about something that's a little older, and that's legacy systems, the total cost of ownership with that. We're going to talk about the thing that separates legacy systems from the modern era, and that's cloud. I do want to note, yes, you've probably heard a lot about cloud. We're not going to be talking about the definitions and things like that, but really specific to how you as a buyer and as a user should be considering this in a real conversation with any system that you're currently using today or considering in the future. We're going to talk about software development, why you should care. I don't mean we're going to talk about a bunch of techs crunching code in a back office. We're going to be talking about the features that roll out to you as a consumer. And then we're going to talk about the modern systems and the total cost of ownership. You can see a theme here. This is a lot about the investment of these business systems, and we're going to take advantage of Gary's knowledge for that. And then, of course, using this business technology as an action item to make the biggest impact on your business. So with that said, Gary, can I get an audio check for you?
I am here, just on.
Perfect. I should have done that a lot earlier, but here we are. So basically, let's start with the total cost of ownership with legacy systems, and let's start at a high level here. What do we mean when we say TCO for business software?
Well, that's a great question, just on, and really what we're looking at is all of the costs that it takes to purchase, implement, and operate on a business system. There are a lot of things that go behind the scenes. Of course, we all know that you have to buy the license, you have to do an implementation of the system, you train your users, and so forth. But then there's also those other costs like the hardware that has to be rotated every few years, servers, workstations, and then the IT support that maintains all of those systems so that you can have a reliable system on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely, and I think that it's easy to overlook some of those things. And let's talk about how we look at TCO today versus how it was previously in a legacy environment. What's different there?
Well, today, with moving a lot of the technology into the cloud, what we're really doing is we're sharing that technology. And so the software providers are picking up a lot of what used to be the hardware and IT support type systems. We certainly pay for the privilege to use those systems, but at least now we're sharing that cost with hundreds or even thousands of other customers.
Sure. And we'll talk about this, a little later in this presentation. Spoiler alert, everyone. But it's really interesting to see, having spoken to CFOs, looking at these purchases, when they think about their budget, it's inherent in their mind to ask the question, well, what kind of hardware upgrades am I going to need for software if I look to make a change or anything like that? And it's not the same discussion anymore, because you don't have to think about those things when we look to modern systems. And it's something you had to think about a lot with legacy systems. So what's some of the areas that we often overlook when we think about total cost of ownership for business technology? You mentioned hardware. I think a lot of people instinctively, they know that that's something they have to pay for. What's some of the stuff we're missing?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that people forget about are lost opportunity costs. If you've had a system that you've been using for the last 5-10 years that's not in the cloud, if you look at the history of those systems, some of them were built 10, 20, or even 30 years ago. And over time, they've adapted to newer technology, but it's going to be a huge step up for them to be able to move in the cloud. So all of the advantages of the newest technology really can never be plugged back into those older systems. And so you lose the effectiveness, the efficiencies, the customer-facing capabilities that we have today. Another area is, as time goes forward, is being able to find people who can support those older technologies. Our brightest young people today were raised on technology, and they've got real expertise, and they understand what the customer expects from technology. And so as our current employees retire and the pool of available talent shrinks, that's going to become much more expensive, as well as we risk systems going down and disruptions in the company's business continuity.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I couldn't tell you how many clients I talk to that the big reason they want to discuss something new is because, it turns out that they had one person in tech or on their staff that knew the system, and they said, hey, in a year I want to retire. And now they realize that this highly custom and, of course, very critical system that was a big part of their business, now they've got to find a way to replace that. And it's hard to think about because every day is business as usual. But what someone really should consider if you're running a legacy technology, and what I mean is anything that you purchased in the last 10 years and that hasn't had significant updates since, it may seem to you, it's fine, it ran just as usual. But you should consider that your competitors in the technology market that you operate in is changing every day. And every day that you move forward on a legacy system, you should count as a lost cost because, just like you said, the number of people who can maintain some of these older systems, this older technology, that pool's dwindling. And, of course, how many people have you spoken to in groups that you've had that they come back with some horror story of needing to hire a very specialized individual to help them move a legacy system, and really maybe it's just moving some files around, but because nobody else knows how to do it, that's now a premium service. It's a luxury practically to run older systems, and we don't look at it that way because it's older.
Absolutely, yeah. And like you say, it's all of those hidden issues that person that's been working there for 30 years knows like the back of his hand, but once he's gone, and we can't predict necessarily when they leave, it really opens us up to huge risk.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I drove an old car, and you had to, it was a manual transmission, and you had to press the gas, let off the clutch in a certain way, not like a standard car, not like a standard manual even. And, big deal. It was a car I drove and I had to get to work in, but hey, if that was running a $50 million company, maybe I'd be a little more attentive to finding the appropriate replacement.
Yeah, we won't talk about what I had to do when I was your age.
I don't want to date you on the hand crank engine method. All right.
Thanks.
So, yeah, you're welcome. So this isn't Gary, for anyone wondering. This is someone who was not harmed in the filming of this image. But I do want to talk about something that it separates the legacy technology from the modern era, and that's cloud. So, Gary, I want to ask you, as a tech person, I can talk all about the marketing words and this and that and whatever some technical journal just wrote about. But what do we really mean when we talk about cloud in the business software environment?
Well, just on, everything seems to happen in cycles, and the cloud really is not a new concept. When I first came out of college, computers were just becoming available to small and medium-sized businesses. And, but they were still very expensive. So there were cottage industries popping up with businesses who would purchase a mainframe or sometimes even a mini computer, and their business model was to share the system with multiple customers. And the term used then was timeshare, which brings up bad memories of the condo I bought one time. But the mainframes and so on as timeshare, you rented a slot of time on the system, on the computer, and loaded your own software on that mainframe and paid for that, the right to use the systems. And the cloud today is really the same concept. The best technology is obtained by a company and rented to hundreds or even thousands of customers. For instance, Microsoft and Amazon have gotten into this in a big way, and they bring the cost down for everybody else. But today's environment, really the touch point or the high point that is so important is that is now occurring with the software and not just the hardware. The software vendors are creating the best technology. They're building systems that none of us could create on our own, and they're renting those out to the customers, such as ordering systems, service scheduling, even payroll and human resource systems. And these are all about providing the best customer experience, whether you're talking about external customers or our internal customers, which include our employees.
Well, I think that's a big distinction to make when we think about software because, Sean Slavin, our VP of technology here and one of the co-owners, has a great analogy when he talks about phones. A telephone and an iPhone, they do the same thing. They can both make a call, but one of them is absolutely essential and can do so much more, and you would never mistaken a telephone for an iPhone. And I think that's how people should be looking at business technology. Just like you said, you used to have software and you'd maybe need a really technical staff to make customizations to work for your business. And nowadays, people should be surprised that you can step into really advanced, really custom software that can do a lot, and that cost is a lot lower because you have people that their whole job is to make this available to multiple customers. And because we have the internet now, you can get those updates and that functionality delivered to you immediately. And it's a big shift in how we look at these things. And let's talk about the real thing because, of course, I can talk about the technology, but let's talk about the costs. How is this impacting costs from what you've seen from when you started in business technology to now?
Well, as we mentioned, the customer is sharing the cost of this huge investment. But on an ongoing basis, you're also sharing the cost of technological improvements as they are rolled out in these systems. And this helps reduce that total cost of ownership because you get incremental improvement over time. I'll give you a couple of examples. When somebody needs a change to a system, of course, a lot of those changes are built in as options within the system. And the software companies can roll these out over a period of time. And as they're rolled out, the customer decides whether or not they need that. And it comes out in smaller chunks. It's easier to train your employees on those changes. And, in the past, those changes, an upgrade may have occurred every year, every other year. If the company just didn't have time to fool with it, it may be 3 or 4 years down the road before they did an upgrade. Well, this became a huge project in and of itself because you had to retrain the employees on virtually the total system.
That's true.
Another example is that recently we were noticing a downgrade in some of the speed of our payroll and HR system. And we got a notice that the vendor was going to increase their capacity by 20%. That expansion took place overnight. It didn't cost us anything extra. Yet the next morning we noticed an increase in speed. And not only did we see that increase, but all of our customers saw that increase as well. So, that increased capability of a faster system and upgrades that normally we would have paid for in the past didn't cost anything additional at this point.
Well, I think that in and of itself it's a big change in how we're looking at, and we're going to talk about TCO, total cost of ownership of newer systems, but it's good to keep in mind that how we look at paying for the software is fundamentally different as we move forward. Let's talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that's I'd like to get your take on how the word cloud has, what's the biggest misconception we think about when we think of the word cloud specific to business technology?
Look, the number one question has always been security. All of a sudden, we can't go touch the server that our data resides on. And so, many are worried about the loss of control, whether or not others are going to be able to access that data fraudulently. And, that is a valid concern. We have to make sure that our provider is making the best effort to keep our data safe. And in addition, we need to know what happens if we do decide to switch providers. How do we get our data? What does it cost to have that data provided to us? And, I think in today's environment, all of the providers know that that's going to be a question. And so they're ready to answer that, and they're certainly ready to exhibit the technology and the security that they have in place to make sure that your data is safe. I think the second area of concern is, can I transition my older system into the cloud? It's very expensive for some of the legacy systems. I mean, really, they have to rebuild the system from scratch. You can't just take a legacy system and push it into the cloud. But what we've seen happen is that they will maybe add additional modules, additional services that they'll put into the cloud, but then they still have to integrate that into your local system. And it's just not as clean and smooth as a brand new system that was built for the cloud. So I urge everyone to really understand what they are buying.
Well, and I think that's a big deal, especially when you think about, when you're when you think about putting everything in the cloud. A lot of hesitancy that you see is, well, my data is coming on the cloud. That sounds really risky. This is the new business fundamental truth of how things will be operating. It'll be this way. It'll be moving forward, barring some massive technological disaster or catastrophe. And, people should consider that these are understood, and it's in every service level agreement you'll ever consider moving forward with newer software. So by all means, consider and read, obviously, the fine print so you feel comfortable with these things, and also challenge your technology partners. If they're putting this out there, ask the uncomfortable question, well, what's the deal with my data? Because, yeah, you should be concerned from the state that this is your business, and obviously you want to preserve that, and have the conversation. You'll feel a lot better, or you won't, but you should feel a lot better when you get those answers given to you.
Correct.
So let's talk about one of the things specifically that you mentioned, and that's that how changes are made to cloud software is a little different. What technological developments, why should people care about new features, new functions being able to be built in these systems and sent out to them? What does this matter for them?
Well, again, today's focus is really on the software. The hardware and the infrastructure is almost an afterthought because we don't have hands-on on that. But we don't have hands-on on the software development itself, but we do how we use it because all of these features are included as options, and we determine which options we use and which ones we don't. But in today's environment, as I mentioned, those are rolled out in smaller and smaller chunks. And so those incremental improvements are much easier to absorb for us. When a customer, it's really become a democratic process, because when a customer has an idea on something that they need improved in the system, they submit that as a request to the provider. The provider accumulates these requests from all of their customers, and when they see certain requests repeated over and over again, and they've got 1,000 of their customers who want that particular change, then they'll put that into the system as a new option, and we can accept that or not accept that change, depending on whether or not we need it. And so it becomes really small little chunks, but those that really need those changes, the accumulation of the requests really determine what gets put into the system. So it's much more democratic than in the past when a legacy system, the architects would just decide, I've seen this in a competitor's product, we ought to put it in ours. Well, it may not be something that anybody else really needed.
That's true. I mean, I worked at a really big company, and they spent years absorbing smaller companies that were seen as competitively viable, and they would spend 3 years trying to develop a hardware product and then push it out to a market that no longer cared because everyone was over that. This new system of updates, and I have this little tangle of feedback here, not to imply complexity, but to show you that it's a consistent feedback loop, and things that people might find frustrating about a user interface, or I don't like how this specific data takes a little longer to load. Well, it's not unusual that you're not alone experiencing that. And with one of the products we represent, they have a public forum that people can post these on, and, their tech gurus will respond to it. Or if enough people get like to it and they don't have an active fix for it, they'll make one. And then they push that out in the next update. And I think that's incredible as a person who, I remember dial-up internet, and that's my metric for how things were and how things could be. And I know that you have much more extreme examples of how things were and how they are today. But I remember when an update took, of course, 12 hours for a small patch on some software. And nowadays, it's like you were saying, it can happen overnight for significant system changes with no downtime. And then tomorrow it feels like you're in, hey, I had a coupe and now I have a sedan. Forgive the car references that I keep making. Something's on my mind. All right, well, let's talk about then, when we consider it used to be a matter of trusting big company names that, hey, Oracle, I know Oracle's a big company. They're going to do right by the software. Things have changed, of course, as you mentioned, smaller, more agile teams. So when we're looking at new systems and companies, what is it that we should be looking for specifically in software functions?
Well, we get really today the best of both worlds regarding the software as well as the hardware and the infrastructure, the technology that stands behind it. In every market today, the customer needs are really primary. And so you're finding a lot of these software companies that are focusing on very particular industries. And they really drill down on that industry's unique needs. So, this provides a much higher degree of effectiveness for our customers and for their customers. And then the upside to this scenario is that we get a much better system from software, but these software providers are then using the expertise of, say, a Microsoft or an Amazon for the infrastructure, and we get the best of both worlds. We get, the huge company which is funding the infrastructure for us, but we get very specific software that matches our customers' needs, and we get all of that for one price.
Well, I think that's something that in the background a lot of people take for granted, but they don't understand specifically. I consider an iPhone or an Android phone, you have an app store, and then the app store is access to all of the things. Maybe it's your bank app, maybe it's a different email client, maybe it's a game. And you realize that these are, probably 6 different companies that are involved in rolling out this single user interface. And the same is happening in business at a much larger scale when smaller companies are creating just perfect software for niche markets or really perfect connections between 2 big systems. Maybe they're automating, invoices to customers. Maybe they're streamlining how work orders are done for, field service requests. And because of APIs, or let me just say because of technology, without getting too much into it, now customers get the benefit of that immediately, and it doesn't serve as some real big overall implementation or project to get the benefit of that. And I think it's great when I hear you say these things. I think it's a big change.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, let's talk about how we look at the total cost of ownership for modern systems. And I've got a little graphic here that's a plant growing because, again, spoiler alert, Gary and I, of course, have talked about this at length. And I think I know where you're going to go with this, but let's talk about how my purchase as a buyer of software, if I'm an executive or upper management and I'm going to talk about this, what's different when I tell my executives and my board about a purchase these days? What's different that they may not be expecting compared to a legacy technology purchase and how it affects the budget?
Well, it's really the typical rent versus buy discussion. In the past, you purchased a license, and that had a huge upfront cost. So by renting that software today, the initial investment is reduced. You still have to pay for the implementation services and training costs when you move to that new system, but the license cost is reduced. Now, paying that annual or monthly rental fee over time one thing you have to consider is that software provider has to continually improve its product, because at any point you could decide that there's a better product out there and you can move. So it really keeps the software developers on their toes and making sure that they are providing the best software at any time in the life cycle.
Well, that is a pretty big shift. I can say from experience, one of the biggest changes that I see is that it used to be people were saying, okay, let's look at how this impacts in year one. And they were expecting a very large number, and then they wouldn't consider anything else because whatever, it's a small maintenance fee after that. And I think, like you were just saying, the difference here is that you have to look at this as a long-term investment. And it keeps changing and it keeps growing with your business and with your environment. But it does take a different set of eyes and a different discussion around how it impacts the budget. And let's talk about that specifically, because is this not really just the market giving the same technology but just changing up the pricing model?
Well, there's always a concern that renting costs more, but you have to remember that it also provides flexibility. The annual fees in and of themselves will likely go up. But don't forget the elimination of costs that we've talked about earlier, not having to maintain hardware and IT staff and all of that, the periodic upgrade costs that go with the older systems when you purchase the license. Going forward, you have small incremental improvements in the systems. Some of these legacy systems, some of them really haven't changed their feature sets in 5-10 years now. So, where does that leave us with efficiency and the ability to use newer technology today? So if you consider the lifetime of the system, you have the opportunity for that cost to actually go down over that time. And there are other considerations as well. As your business changes, you may need more users. Some systems, of course, priced by the user. Some don't. But if you have a blip where you need additional users for a period of time, you rent those. When you no longer need them, your rent cost comes back down. The same with particular modules. You may have an arm of your business that requires a specific module. If that is no longer needed, you can reduce your cost by that amount. So it really affords you the flexibility that rentals afford you. Just like moving offices, if you need less space, you find a smaller office and you pay less rent. If you need a larger office,
like that, without needing,
and pay that
the
rent.
construction to move walls, or without needing the fee to actually move all your substance. I think that's a great way of looking at how flexible this new technology is.
Sure.
And you said something there that I want to touch on, and I don't want to lose sight of it because it was mentioned in that CFO survey, and that's the efficiency and how this technology is helping companies stay competitive. It's something that I don't think a lot of people had looked at. But when you're buying the software, it used to be that you'd buy software for a very specific function. And nowadays, it's doing more than ever. And we really should consider how this investment is utilized in a system. So I have a graphic here because I've heard you mention this before, and I want you to speak to it. And let's talk to, how do businesses often get stuck underutilizing an investment in their technology?
Well, I think it doesn't matter really whether you're talking about a legacy system or a cloud. One of the biggest problems we see is not fully utilizing the system that is available to you. And so, one of the issues here is when you really take on a new system and all of your people have day jobs. I mean, they have to get the work done. They have to take care of the customers. And so implementing a new system is like ripping the guts out of a vehicle that's trying to move down the road at 60 miles an hour. You can't replace the engine and transmission and continue to move forward. So a lot of times shortcuts are made. We decide that, maybe we just need to get back to a functional position just like we had before in the old system, and we'll make those additional improvements later. Well, later sometimes never comes. So we always ask if we can come back in 6 months or a year and really stop and analyze, whether or not they're using the system the way they envisioned to begin with. And I think that's where we see the underutilization is not being able to get everything done in the initial implementation.
I remember being in college and someone said that when you do a big strategic overhaul for a business, you'll spend, maybe years, and you'll come up with this really great binder of actions that need to get done, and then the client will look at it and they'll say, that looks really good, and then they put it on their shelf and they never open it again. And I think that we look at a lot of big investments like this because business has to get done. So what happens is we have really great plans, and you hear this in discussions with people, that already have a really great system in place, and they say, well, originally we were going to do this too, but we couldn't get around to it. Something comes up, and it always does because that's the world we live in. It's rare to have someone dedicated only to looking at how to improve a system or technology. But something I think people really need to talk about is what that costs their business. So I want to ask you, as, of course, a resident financial expert on this stuff, what's the impact of suboptimal utilization in business technology?
Well, bottom line is that, when you purchase a new system, if your processes and your procedures don't change, then really you've wasted your investment in that new system. You're doing the exact same thing you were doing before, but you've paid a bunch of money for that privilege to do it. So you're really coming back and making the improvements that you envisioned, the reason behind making the decision, you've got to get those implemented.
And I think that's an outstanding way of thinking about it. It's deceptively simple. The hard part, of course, is finding the time to do it. So let's talk about what can we do as a business, when we look at these changes, what can we do to get that done?
Well, I think you have to, of course, realize, the first step is always understanding where you are in the situation. So, we have to answer a real simple question. When was the last time we actually looked for and made improvements in our processes? If we've performed the same tasks in the same way for several months or years, we're probably underutilizing the technology we have in place because that technology is continually changing. Not only that, but our businesses are changing. We have new product lines, we have new services, we have new ways that we may be approaching the customer, but we haven't changed our systems to match that.
Well, I think that's a really good point, and I have this graphic here so everyone can see, when typically what you see in a new system purchase, if we start at the left part of this, is that you have an innovation trigger. So you say, hey, there's something that needs to change, and we need to look at a technology that can help us. So then you start the journey, and you see what it is that you want to see, and then you're there, your expectations are up, and then you implement. And you fall into the trough of disillusionment because you realize that it's really tough. It's really hard because the part that no vendor can ever fully prepare a client for is how much of their own business processes will change. And I say this from experience. We work closely with many of those who are on the webinar today and other clients, of course, helping them through these processes, and they realize that there are things that they couldn't have even thought of until they're in the trough, if you will, in the trenches, trying to make those changes. And then you come out of that, you start using, and you reach your plateau of productivity. And I think this is the thing that people think, well, this is my natural state. I'm productive. It's great. And what people don't realize is that along this banner of time, there also comes your competition and changes in the marketplace that lower this plateau of productivity. So pretty soon you're at the innovation trigger phase, but you don't realize it. because you have business as usual to to address. And what I hear you say as we talk about underutilization of technology is that a lot of us may be in that state and we don't realize it until something happens to trigger it. And oftentimes it's a crisis. Often it's, oh, one of my business critical servers failed and I didn't realize that this technology was a little older than I expected, and now I need to find a brand new system and implement it yesterday.
Yeah,
and
it's almost a cliche anymore, but we have to take the time to work on our business and not just always work in the business. And so, what I like to phrase this as is continual improvement. It's not terribly new, but you look at processes like Six Sigma and lean manufacturing and those types of things. It's all about a continual cycle of analyzing where you're at, looking for improvements, and then spending the time to make those improvements. And once you get one small improvement done, you go into the next cycle. Let's analyze it again. What else can we do to improvement? If you make one or two improvements every 2 or 3 months, every quarter, at the end of 3 years, your whole business has really changed. And you look back and you see all of the improvements you've made, and you're really a different company. But it's getting into the habit of going through that cycle.
Well, and I think it's one of the big reasons that you see a lot of these large software publishers, and certainly the most agile among them, relying closely on partners. And sure, I'm gonna be a bit of a CS3 stan when I say this, but it's really great to have these discussions with clients because you can have an in-depth discussion about where the business is going better than any publisher could because they're busy making changes to software. Mm-hmm. It's hard to have that business level discussion, so it's really great to have a partner that can address that with you. And I certainly know that I welcome anyone who helps me with my business who can challenge that for me and say, hey, you've reached a plateau of sorts. Let's talk about where the market is and why you may not be there and what you could benefit from being there. I think that's huge. It's one of the big changes for sure.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely.
So let's do a recap here, and then we'll get to Q&A. We talked really about what's changed in business software, in business technology in general from legacy today. We talked about TCO, what costs are there, what costs we don't see that are still impacting us. We talked about the big impact of cloud, how that's really drawn a line between legacy technology and modern technology. And functionally how that impacts how customers get their new features. And then we talked a lot about how businesses are looking at the system utilization.
Okay. Yeah, I do have, Gary, I know you used the phrase legacy several times through this. Can you define or give some examples of what you would consider legacy systems?
Well, I think just Don mentioned, probably any system that was purchased in the last 5 to 10 years. Systems which are not in the cloud, that you buy once. And, that I don't want to throw, the baby out with the bathwater. Some of the developers are doing a good job of keeping their systems up to date. Most of them are not. They have invested a huge sum of money decades ago, and they're not getting enough in support fees in order to stay up with the technology. And so, if you see your system with very minimal upgrades over time, that's a legacy system. They're not staying up with today's technology.
It's really, we've done 2 hyper jumps in the time of that I've been in this market. That transition from DOS to Windows was everybody had to rewrite software, and the same thing is happening in Windows to browser. And some of those publishers haven't done that well.
And another change was the databases themselves, going from proprietary databases to SQL. And some of these legacy systems aren't even in SQL today. So, they're really long in the tooth, if you will.
Yeah. The other one I have here, you talked about things going out into the cloud. Maybe you're just on can address this because we have our clients on here today. Can you confirm the server farms for Acumatica and Kronos, how that's managed or handled? Just on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's important that everyone realizes that one of the big benefits of cloud is security, and we don't just say that to blanket the statement. The fact is, these are on Tier 4 data centers hosted by Amazon, which runs. I couldn't give you the stat because it changes and grows every day, but it definitely runs some of the most business-critical cloud software. And when I say Tier 4, I'm talking about triple, quadruple failovers in disaster-resistant bunkers of data centers. And one of the big benefits of this is, although we are a technology company, I'll be the first to say that our data center is not as secure as, and I mean our custom data center, our own, our server
inside
closet,
inside our four walls here in our physical building. Yeah,
is not going to be as secure as a Tier 4, and this is government level security of technology that we house our cloud basis.
Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, so that was just terrific, guys. Thank you so much. And Gary, we're so grateful for you to have taken the time out of running the business and spend some time with our clients today. I know that they appreciate that too.
It was my pleasure.